I think we can start. We have an amazing crowd tonight. Thank you so much for coming. And it's so good to know that everybody's excited about this topic, and of course about Hrag, who has never spoken for the Armenian Institute before, so we're very proud to be hosting him tonight. I'm Susan Caddy. I'm the interim director of the Armenian Institute, and I am the bearer of glad tidings tonight. We've been talking about moving for some time. Papazian, welcome tonight. Thank you for coming, and we're very excited to have so many people here tonight who are evening. We're very, very happy to have Hrag Papazian on a whirlwind tour of British, basically Cambridge, Oxford, all over the place. He's giving his talks, but he will be settling down on Monday, I think, to defend his PhD. And so we congratulate you ahead of time. I'm sure it's going to be a great success. Hrag Papazian did his fieldwork in Turkey for 20 months on the construction and experience of Armenian identity there. He studied especially the Armenians of Istanbul, not necessarily the Bolsetsis, as those of you who know Istanbul know that there are a variety of Armenians there now. And he was especially concerned with the ethnic religious discrimination, with the transmission of fear and a habitus of cautiousness. I like that phrase, the self-censorship that goes on, and the invisibility. He's also studying those who are dissenters, those who are fighting against this, who work against it, including the Hrant Dink Foundation, Agos Aras Publishing, and Norzar Tank, and others. At the same time, Hrag's research is very important as a way of understanding the Turkish state and society, state ideology, the treatment of minorities, identity politics, and the nation-building processes that are going on there. So please welcome Hrag with me tonight, and we look forward very much to hearing about this complex subject.
Right. Thank you, Susan, for the introduction. Thank you all for coming. And thanks to the Armenian Institute for organizing this and for inviting me here. So as Susan said, I will be defending my thesis soon. That's in 3 or 4 days. And so my thesis is just a little bit more about my thesis. It's about the different factions of Armenians living in contemporary Turkey. By that I mean, first of all, the traditional Christian Armenian community, mostly based in Istanbul. These are the ones we call Bolsahayuchun or Tırkahayuchun. Second, migrants from the Republic of Armenia who have been migrating to Turkey, mainly to Istanbul, since the 1990s. And finally, Muslim and or Alevi Armenians who have started to publicly emerge again since the 1990s. So I speak about the diversification of Turkey's Armenian landscape, that's how I put it, and the reasons of it, and especially how these three different factions relate to each other, whether they accept each other's Armenianness or not. But today I will be mainly presenting the third group, that is the Muslim and Alevi Armenians.
Could you speak a little louder?
Yes, in contemporary Turkey. So let me start with the questions I will be addressing tonight. First of all, what factors triggered or facilitated the public emergence of Muslim and Alevi Armenians? What is Armenianness for them? How do they interpret it, and why so? How are they treated by the Turkish state and Muslim majority? What does their Armenian identification consist of in practice? What does it mean to be a Muslim or Alevi Armenian? What has motivated them to embrace Armenian identity in a country where being Armenian is one of the least favorable identities one can have? Where do they stand in relation to the state's categories and definition of Armenianness? And finally, how are they treated by the Christian Armenian community of Istanbul? I will try to answer these questions, but first let me give some basic information about the people, about the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. A bit of a historical background. So Muslim and Alevi Armenians of Turkey are descendants of Islamized Armenians who converted during different periods of Ottoman or Turkish history. Perhaps the oldest of those conversions, to which my interlocutors traced their familial histories, took place from the 17th century onwards in the historical Armenian canton of Hamshen, corresponding to the contemporary province of Rize, situated in the eastern Black Sea region of Turkey. Many, though surely not all, and that is important, not all descendants of those converts identify as Hemshin or Hamshen Armenian today. The next mass conversions occurred during the Armenian Massacres of 1894 to 1897, that's the Hamidian Massacres, when around 456 Armenian villages are said to have been forcibly converted to Islam. Most of my Muslim and Alevi Armenian research participants' ancestors, though, converted during or immediately after the Armenian genocide of 1915. But also Islamization occurred during the Republican era, that is, after 1923. Notably, Christian Armenians of Tunceli, previously called Dersim, were targeted as part of the 1937-38 army offensive in the region. Some of them were killed, and others had to officially convert to Islam and later assimilate into the local Alevi religion. Now, what terminology to use? Hidden Armenians, secret Armenians, crypto-Armenians, Muslim Armenians, Islamized Armenians, these terms have been used in the burgeoning literature around these people, but also in media generally. I'd like to address these terms, distance myself from some of them, and elucidate basically who exactly are the subjects I call Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians. The hidden or crypto adjectives are mostly used in non-academic spheres and are problematic because, first of all, they often have political connotations. Turkish nationalists often depict a conspiratorial image of the Gizli Ermeniler, that is the secret Armenians, presenting them as camouflaged enemies of the Turkish nation. The notion of the hidden is also compatible with essentialist understandings of identity that are inclined to categorize all people with Armenian ancestry as Armenians and dismiss their claims of non-Armenianness as mere acts of concealment or denial. In particular, some Armenian authors have a clear tendency to reveal a hidden Armenianness among descendants of Islamized Armenians, even when they do not consider themselves as such. I consider Islamized Armenians to be a totally valid term when used to describe Armenians baptized as Christians but then converted. Whereas its usage is generally accurate in historical studies, it is often misleading and anachronistic when applied for contemporary people who have not converted to Islam themselves, but are rather descendants of such converts. Now, descendants of Islamized Armenians, another term used in the literature, corrects this mistake, but that would be a category covering probably several million Muslims in Turkey, people having a grandmother who was Armenian, or a grandfather or great-grandmother, but not necessarily identifying as Armenians today. So that is why I use simply Muslim Armenian. And by that I mean Muslim citizens of Turkey identifying as Armenians. But that would still be inappropriate for the Alevi Armenians of Tunceli and Dersim. Although Alevi Armenians are officially classified as Muslims in their identity cards, like all Alevis in Turkey, they usually do not identify as Muslims, like most Alevis in Turkey, as they consider Alevism to be distinct from Islam. That is why I call them simply Alevi Armenians. So this is what I mean by Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians. These are the people about whom this talk is, and my thesis is basically, so only people who actually identify themselves as Armenians, not people whom we would like or we might like to see or to categorize as Armenians. Now, about the public emergence of these Muslim and Alevi Armenians. There are at least three structural developments in Turkey that have contributed to the gradual public emergence of Muslim and Alevi Armenians. First of all, internal migration. Since the 1950s, Turkey witnessed an internal migration from the eastern countryside to the western urban centers. Then, in the 1980s and onwards, emigration towards the west increased further from the mostly Kurdish-populated southeast after the start of the armed conflict between the Turkish army and the Kurdish guerrillas. Now, many descendants of Islamized Armenians live in these eastern regions, especially the Kurdish populated regions, and they naturally took part in this migration from the east to the west. Now, this migration in turn became a factor facilitating the establishment of some of these people's links with Armenian identity. First, those in Istanbul were now in proximity to the established Christian Armenian community and its institutions. They had Armenian neighbors, Armenian co-workers, in some cases even relatives who had moved to Istanbul much earlier and who had stayed Christian. Second, they soon discovered that being Armenian in cosmopolitan Istanbul was easier than it was in the east. They were now in a large city where their Armenianness, if they so desired, could be expressed situationally and still remain unnoticed, whereas in their villages, any such manifestation would jeopardize their relations with the small number of co-villagers on which their economic sustainability and daily security was highly dependent. However, migration was not enough for the public emergence of these Armenians. In fact, those arriving before the 1990s started to actively and publicly engage with Armenianness only at the turn of the century. Why? Now, two crucially and mutually supportive processes were slowly evolving in Turkey just before and during the period of emergence of these Armenians. First of all, a reconfiguration of identity politics in the country, and second, the process of gradual democratization, though this latter has begun to rapidly crumble in the late 2000s. The Kurdish movement from the late 1970s onwards gradually changed the equations of identity politics in the country and succeeded in shattering the official ideology of ethnic homogeneity. In the early 2000s, the AKP-led Turkish state had started to loosen its grip on minorities, and the idea of a national identity based on citizenship rather than ethnic identity, ethnic cultural Turkishness, had always been, as it had always been, was being pushed forward. In parallel, Turkey was slowly moving towards democratization. A discourse on civil society and civil rights was emerging in the country since the 1980s. To the internal developments was added an external pressure by the European Union, and that also incited the AKP, the political party, to launch a series of democratization packages and implement legislative reforms on rights and freedoms. Now, this was the context in which a critical narrative on the Armenian genocide started to emerge in Turkey. And that was soon to be followed by public discussions about the fate of the Islamized Armenian genocide survivors and their descendants. A literature on those forgotten Armenians emerged, and soon Muslim and Alevi citizens started to publicly claim Armenian identity. Some of them got baptized, while others came forth as Muslim Armenians and Alevi Armenians. The last 2 decades even witnessed attempts of self-organizing by these newly emerged Armenians, who have come together and established cultural associations, first in Istanbul and then even in Mush, Tunceli, and other eastern cities. All of this was made possible by the positive change in the Turkish context. That's important to note. But then there's a third factor, and that's the Islamization of Turkish society and Turkish politics. I argue that the foregrounding of the previously suppressed Islamic identity in the country has also played a role in the activation of the Muslim Armenian identity. Secularism was one of the key principles of the Republic of Turkey since its establishment and had mostly succeeded in limiting Islam to the private sphere. But things started to change in the 1980s again. In fact, the strongest current to emerge as a result of the general reconfigurations of identity politics in Turkey was Islam. Islam gradually gained public visibility and returned to politics. Now, the politics of Islamization was further enhanced with the rise to power of an Islamist political leadership, which was basically headed by AKP, the Justice and Development Party. In this new context, where religious identity was foregrounded, people would naturally find it easier to come out as Armenians but Muslims. Despite the AKP's reversion to a nationalist rhetoric beginning in 2016, the discourse foregrounding Islam in the preceding years had already had its positive influence on the Muslim Armenians, who in this new Muslim nation had become more confident with their identities and more trusting toward their Muslim brothers and sisters, from whom they expected and at times received positive treatment as fellow Muslims. So this was the context in which these Muslim and Alevi Armenians emerged. So after this introduction, let me proceed with their understanding of Armenianness. What do they understand by being Armenian? What is Armenian identity for them? Now, most Christian Armenians in Turkey, but also elsewhere, understand Armenianness as an essentially religious, or at best ethno-religious category. For them, in simpler words, an Armenian cannot be but Christian. Unfortunately, I don't have time to explain and explain the reasons behind that, which in Turkey are even more. This is even more stronger. Turkish Armenians, Turkish Christian Armenians, have a conception of Armenianness which is very, very, very much based on religion. So that's even beyond what you would see in other diasporic Armenian communities or in Armenia. But unfortunately, as I said, I don't have time for that. I might develop that if you wish during the Q&A period. Now, Muslim and Alevi Armenians, on the other hand, have a different approach. Armenianness for them is independent from religion. Whereas most of the Christian Armenians, state representatives, and the media, the Turkish media, usually refer to the Armenians as a Jamaat, that means religious congregation, from Jama'iyya in Arabic. My Muslim or Alevi Armenian interlocutors reject that term in favor of one of the following: Kavim, meaning nation, tribe, or people in Turkish; halk, meaning people; soy, meaning lineage or ancestry; and ırk, the most widely used and translatable to race in English. Using the word ırk, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians suggest that Armenians constitute a lineage, and accordingly Armenianness is an inherited, pre-ascribed, primordial, even genetic, that's the word they use, characteristic.
I'm sorry, Hrag, whoever's phone is going off, could you please stop it now? Is it not a phone?
Yep. Should I?
I'm sorry to interrupt you.
That's fine. So they argue that Armenians. They argue that they are Armenians because of being genetically Armenian, because of, I quote, possessing Armenian veins and blood. Armenianness for them is a matter of öz in Turkish, literally meaning essence. Literally it means essence. A concept they consistently evoke. They would say, my öz, benim özüm Ermenidir. So my öz is Armenian, my essence is Armenian, and I'm Armenian by essence. The Armenian öz is imagined to be always and already there, even if its bearer is not aware of it. Öz and descent have one limitation though: sex. Irk, for these Armenians by blood, as they call themselves, is patrilineal. In other words, one's maternal ancestry does not determine one's lineage, although the results of Erhan's DNA test also showed that he was the grandchild of Islamized Greeks. He never identifies himself as Greek because that connection is through his maternal side. I quote him, "Just as I took my Y chromosome from my father, I take my identity from him." Unsurprisingly, this essentialist approach considers religion to be irrelevant when it comes to categorizing Armenians. I quote, "Being a Muslim does not change our irk," I was often told by my informants. One elderly Muslim Armenian man from Mush metaphorically explained their situation as follows, quote, "We changed our milk, but not our blood. The milk symbolizing nourishment, spiritual in this case, and blood referring to the irk, to the race." Now, why this essentialist approach? Why this öz-based understanding of Armenianness? First of all, because of being discriminated and categorized in that way. Despite letting go of Christianity and official Armenianness, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians were generally not welcomed into the Turkish nation and its Muslim majority, and were still stigmatized and mistreated as Armenians by descent. I first met Asadur in the courtyard of an Armenian church in Istanbul. A 71-year-old, thin, timid man, raised and classified as a Muslim, Asadur was a resident of Malatya, a city in eastern Turkey, and had come to Istanbul for only a few days. "I'm Armenian," he said in a very low voice, took a paper out of his pocket, unfolded it, and showed me his hand-drawn family tree as a proof. He gave me an appointment and promised to tell his story. A week later, I journeyed for 2 hours to Maltepe, a district in the suburbs of Asian Istanbul, in order to interview him. He was extremely careful not to be overheard. He spoke to me in an extremely low voice, to the extent of causing difficulties when it came to transcribing the interview. However, the one and only controversial or dangerous reason, or dangerous theme in his whole story was simply his being of Armenian descent and his recent work toward, as he says, regaining Armenianness. This cautiousness was not unique to Asadur and was shared by many of my Muslim or Alevi interlocutors, though to differing degrees. It has one main source: their experience of discrimination and harassment as Ermeni oğlu Ermenis, Ermeni dölüz, or Ermeni piges, respectively meaning Armenian son of an Armenian, see the thinking there, son of an Armenian, Armenian spawn or sperm, and Armenian bastard in Turkish, all terms having to do with lineage, with ancestry. Asadur was born in 1945 in the city of Malatya. He remembers having an Islamic lifestyle during his childhood and, as he says, growing up according to the Turkish Islamic synthesis. He knew nothing about his family's past until he was 16, when a friend made fun of him by calling him dönük, a Turkish adjective meaning turned, often used as a label for converts. I felt like I'd been shot in the heart, recalls Asadur, and ran home to my mother asking for explanations. Succumbing to his insistence, the mother advised him to go to his uncle Mehmet, saying that he might know the story. A few days later, the uncle called him after the Friday Islamic prayer and asked him to promise not to tell what you will hear now to anyone, and that for at least 25 years. And that's what he did, and it wasn't for the 25 years. If it weren't, I wouldn't hear his story. After promising to abide by his uncle's condition, he learned their familial history of Islamization. Nevertheless, he continued to self-identify and live as a Turkish Muslim, until a much later stage in his life, when he realized that his Armenian past and the related stigma were inescapable. In fact, he has experienced a whole series of irk-based, race-based, discriminatory acts since that first insult of dönük in high school. When he applied to the military school, he was rejected for no obvious reason at all and was told that he had, I quote, Armenianness in your genes. Still not giving up on his will to be welcomed into Turkishness, he studied Turkish language and literature in Ankara. During his university years, however, he became acquainted with leftist political movements and eventually joined the Kurdish political movement, the student movement. He still did not identify as an Armenian, though, but rather looked at the world, as he recalls, through the lens of humanism. He was jailed for his political activities in the 1990s. In 2006, already 61 years old, he suffered a third discriminatory attack, which became a decisive turning point for him. A friend showed him a news piece on a Turkish nationalist media outlet where his name appeared in a blacklist of pro-Kurdish political activists. That was fine for him. Unlike everyone else, though, he was ascribed an epithet, Ermeni dölü, Armenian spawn or sperm in Turkish. Faced with this act of public discriminatory labeling, he realized that his Armenian heritage was inescapable and finally decided, when he was 61, under the pressure of lifelong hateful categorization, to internalize Armenian identity and call himself Asadur, drawing on his great-grandfather's Armenian name, which you can see on the top. Öz-based discrimination was thus a key factor, convincing him that he could never fully become a Muslim Turk, and that what counts after all is his essence, his irk, his genes and his genealogy, rather than his religion, political belonging and self-identification. He was the grandson of Asadur, whether he wanted it or not. Origin or ancestry-based anti-Armenian discrimination and hate speech is not peculiar to Asadur, of course. It is rather a generalized phenomenon in Turkey and has targeted almost all of my Muslim or Alevi Armenian acquaintances. The state knows it, has been often said to me by many interlocutors, arguing that the state has information about people of Armenian descent. Apart from Asadur, at least 2 other research participants told that their applications to the Turkish army had been rejected only because of their Armenian ancestry. As shown by historian Taner Akçam, the practice of monitoring Armenian converts had started at least in the late Ottoman period during the genocide that led to most of those forced conversions. But it continued during the Republican years as well, with secret population censuses, and this is how they were called, counting citizens who were, that's how it's mentioned, not of the Turkish irk, so not of the Turkish race. very straightforwardly, and had converted to Islam in the immediate aftermath of 1915. So these Armenians thus live in and are themselves part of racialized societies, as Bonilla Silva would call it, where Irk is often the master status in interpersonal relations, especially in the absence of religious difference. They are, moreover, constantly otherized on the basis of their Irk, both by the state and ordinary Turks, Kurds, or Arabs. It is thus not surprising that they perceive Armenianness as a hereditary, Irk-based, Öz-based identity. Now, there's also a second factor, which is the fact that they live in societies which have this based on some, I don't know, some documents that they had kept, some letters. And I was actually very, very lucky for having the opportunity out of nowhere of actually finding the relatives of my childhood friend, my classmate in Beirut. And that's my classmate's grandmother there, sitting with her family. So I went to Adıyaman, near Adıyaman. There's a town near Adıyaman, Kahta, and I went to this house to a Muslim Armenian family, and I had no clue that I would be finding this. But the moment when they learned that I'm from Beirut, they went in and they brought this letter and these photos, saying that, you know, we know that we have a relative there, and basically our grandfather's brother left for Beirut, and we were in touch, and this is a letter sent by him, but then we lost contact. They even said that their son even traveled to Beirut, to Burj Hamid, 2 years before I was in Adıyaman, tried to find them, but he couldn't. I read the letter, and to my surprise, it was written by Mardiros Demircan, which is the name of the father of my classmate. And I knew from my classmate that he also knew that the brother of his great-grandfather was left in Adıyaman. They became Muslim, and that's why eventually they cut ties. The two brothers cut ties. Now, I took the photo. I sent this photo to my classmate, and he said, "Well, that's my grandmother." And he said, "I have this exact same photo at home." And his grandfather had sent the photo to this family in Adıyaman, and it was a shocking moment for all of us. And we opened Skype, and they spoke to each other. I translated Armenian to Turkish, etc. But why am I telling this? In order to stress on the importance they give to ancestry, to family, to the branches of the family, which is partly, at least, affected by the Ashiret culture in which they live. So lineage and ancestry are extremely important for these people, which further explains why their approach to identity and belonging in general would be centered on these notions. But also, the fact that outsiders approach them through the same prism of Ashiret identities constantly reminds them of their Armenian past as well. As the Ashiret culture is dominant in those Eastern Anatolian regions, and among recent migrants from these regions in Istanbul, asking someone about his Ashiret belonging is very common. Ferid, a 25-year-old Muslim Armenian living in Mush, told me during his visit to Istanbul that he previously did not identify as an Armenian. Whenever asked, he used to say that he is an Arab, since his family was Arabic-speaking and lived in an Arab-populated area in Sassoon. However, the second question would often be about the Ashiret he belonged to, and that would eventually reveal that in reality, and that's the word he uses, in reality I'm not an Arab, but an Armenian, because they all know about the Ashirets in those villages. So after a few such embarrassing experiences, Ferid has decided to answer straightforwardly that he is an Armenian. Consequently, what else could Armenianness mean for Ferid and others like him, if not lineage and ancestry? So this much about their understanding and interpretation of Armenian identity, which is quite different from that of the Christian Armenians and the migrants also from Armenia. And I study in my thesis what happens when they meet each other, right? Now, what does their Armenian identification consist of in practice? What do they do? Do they just say we're Armenians, or what? Learning about their Armenian ancestry, some descendants of Islamized and Alevized Armenians have eventually made the decision to, I quote, become Armenian again, or özüme dönmek, that means to return to my essence, as many of them said. In other words, they have started to self-identify as Armenians, present themselves to others as such, and in many cases actively engage in activities related to Armenianness. How do they do it? What do they do exactly? Several of them, for instance, have decided to substitute their Turkish Islamic names with Armenian ones, like Asadur or Dikran, Hasan Dikran. Now, some of them do that even legally by applying to courts. Others are learning the Armenian language. I had organized classes of Armenian, and many of them came. Some even try to symbolically reharmonize their familial past by writing the original Armenian names of their parents or grandparents on their graves. Others aim to transmit their Armenianness into the future generations of their lineage. A few young Muslim and Alevi Armenian friends stated that they would like to marry an Armenian so that their children, quote, live as full-fledged Armenians and not like us. One friend even asked me to help him find an Armenian bride. Some who are not pious, so not pious Muslims or Alevis, are even ready to baptize their children in order for them to meet the criteria for attending Armenian schools. I'm going to come back to this. I have encountered such cases even in Adıyaman, where a few brothers have converted to Christianity and now send their children to Armenian boarding schools in Istanbul. Whereas a few of these new converts professed to having converted in true faith and guided by religious motivations, most have stated that the true incentive behind the conversion was the will to regain Armenianness. Getting baptized, they thought, was the only way to get full access to the Armenian community of Istanbul, become acknowledged as Armenians by everyone, including the state, and thus be able to fully live as an Armenian. Socializing with mainstream Armenians is yet another strategy serving the aim of returning to the essence. The most immediate environment for doing that is the Istanbulite Christian Armenian community, of course, but going to Armenia has also been an important experience for many who aimed to not only see the country and experience its culture, but also get to know, I quote, how and who the Armenians are. Most of those visiting Armenia said that their visit resulted in quite strong emotional ties with the country, and they were determined to return there again. "My soul belongs to Armenia," wrote one of my students in broken Armenian after his first visit. Some Muslim and Alevi Armenians even engage in pro-Armenian activism. I have seen several of them at protest marches on the day of Dink's assassination and on 24 April, the commemoration day of the genocide. Thus, Muslim and Alevi Armenians proactively engage in a process of cultural and social Armenization, as one of them put it, trying to replenish our emptied pool of Armenian identity. But what exactly triggers these people's daring Armenization? Why has Abdullah become Asadur? Why has Hassan become Dikran? Why does Erhan actively advocate Armenianness through his Facebook page? Why have my students decided to learn the language? And why have many visited Armenia? Some Christian Armenians of Istanbul judge the Muslim Alevi Armenians as insincere and motivated by pure interest and profit. Becoming Christian, asking for financial help from the community, getting access to the Armenian schools and other institutions, applying for asylum in Europe as members of a persecuted community, and so on. Although I have personally not met anyone of whom I had such an impression, I cannot rule out the possibility of the existence of such particular cases. But for most of my Muslim and Alevi interlocutors, coming out as Armenian has been quite difficult and brought with it social, psychological, or financial losses rather than profits. How could, in fact, declaring Armenianness be easy in a society where anti-Armenianness is so widespread? When Aisha started to express her Armenian identity more openly, giving interviews about it to local media outlets, her employers warned her, arguing that she was putting their organization at risk by portraying a bad image of them with her Armenian public identity and discourse. Ertürk, an Alevi Armenian pop singer, received messages from some of his fans who wrote about their disappointment after he had shared Armenian-related material through his social media account. Peer and family pressure are other serious negative consequences. Some Muslim or Alevi Armenians lost friends and even family members, uncles or siblings after coming out as Armenians. I thus argue that by choosing the path of Armenian identification and social cultural Armenization, despite the often predictable difficulties, these Muslim and Alevi Armenians present a challenge to theories of political ethnicity, instrumentalism, and interest-based identification. In fact, their Armenian identification is even anti-instrumental. It may absolutely be the case that Kohon's Hosa traders of Ibadan and many others elsewhere had used, reinforced, or even cultivated ethnic ties primarily for instrumental reasons, but the cases of the Muslim and Alevi Armenians of Turkey clearly differ from those and cannot be explained by purely political and instrumentalist approaches to identity and group formation. What then, if not interest-based strategizing? First of all, these people's Armenian identification consists of a quest for belonging and recognition. Charles Taylor's claim about the social recognition of identity being a vital human need proves itself true once again in the case of Muslim and Alevi Armenians. For many of them, in fact, the need for recognition and fully acknowledged belonging to a certain social category is an important, emotional rather than instrumental factor, prompting them to publicly identify as Armenians despite the risks involved. The impression of feeling incomplete, I quote them, as one of them said, or being imprisoned in a false, distorted and reduced mode of being, in Taylor's words, is clearly visible among many Muslim or Alevi Armenians. I quote, "Belonging to nothing is increasingly bothering me." A man from Kayseri wrote to me, he added, "Turks think I am a Circassian, while Circassians do not accept me as one of their own. What can one do when no single Irk treats him as a member? He either returns to his origins, like a bird that has lost its flock, or remains permanently in between and becomes miserable like us." Many Muslim and Alevi Armenians' liminal condition and the resulting structural invisibility, as Turner would put it, is thus a subjective psychological factor prompting them to long for hard lines and clear concepts, in the words of Mary Douglas, and self-identify as Armenians. In other words, it is a matter of choosing stigmatized but solid belonging over miscategorization and misrecognition that are not, as seen above, really exempt of discrimination anyway. Second, Armenian identification consists of a moral political project resisting to discrimination and assimilation. Asked about the most important reasons leading her to the internalization of Armenian identity, Aslihan answered, I quote, "They killed my ancestors. They stole an identity from them and me. The Der Garabedian name disappeared, and not in a natural way. That's why I feel I have to change my family name back to it. There is injustice involved, you see. Otherwise my Armenian past would not really matter to me. If there were no genocide, no forceful assimilation, I would probably be indifferent because I don't really care about nationalities." And also remember Asadur's case, which was again a reaction to continuous discrimination against him and against humiliation, basically. For some, there is an additional factor encouraging them to counter anti-Armenian discrimination and assimilation with Armenian identification, and that factor is ideology. For Erhan, for example, accepting his Armenian roots and openly speaking about it is also a condition for being a good Muslim, because Allah urges his followers to be sincere and speak the truth. For others, their leftist, revolutionary, anti-nationalist or anti-state ideologies play a similar role. "Culturally I'm not, but ideologically I am Armenian," said one of them. Thus, Armenization for these people constitutes not so much a tactical move in pursuit of political, economic or social capital, but a quest for belonging and recognition, and a symbolic action driven by moral and ideological obligations. It is thus an effective moral and political project against injustice, discrimination and assimilation. Despite all the suffering, the loss of social capital, and the breaking of his familial ties, Erhan's closing remarks were the following: "Ermeni olmayı seviyorum. I like being Armenian." Now, about the fact that they contest Armenianness, and they contest and they challenge the state's understanding and categories of Armenians and other ethnic or national groups. Armenians in Turkey have always been officially acknowledged and treated as a religious minority, as one of the country's non-Muslim minorities. The legal basis of this approach is to be found in the famous Treaty of Lausanne, signed in 1923 between the newly established Republic of Turkey and the Allied forces. In Articles 38 to 45 of the treaty's Section 3, titled Protection of Minorities, the term minority is always preceded by the adjective non-Muslim, thus stressing the religious nature of minorities. These non-Muslim minorities were not explicitly named in the treaty, but in practice the Turkish state has always considered the Armenians, the Jews and the Greeks as eligible for that status. Being a member of the Armenian community thus was somehow equated to being a follower of one of the Armenian churches. Armenianness was perceived as a religion to the extent that even the word Armenian was used for designating citizens' religious belonging. And this is an old identity card which I found in one of the associations in Istanbul. And you can actually see right in front of that box, Dini, that is his religion, and it's called Ermeni. So his religion is Armeni. So it's to that extent Armenianness is portrayed as officially categorized as a religious identity. And it's similar for the case of the Greeks and the others. Whereas Muslim ethnic identities are not recognized as minorities. That's why the Kurds had and still have a serious problem. And many others like the Circassians, the Arabs, they are considered to be part of the majority, and there are constant efforts of Turkifying them. The Muslim Armenians are thus not perceived as members of the Armenian minority, which is by definition non-Muslim. These people's Armenian identification thus challenges and even seeks to dismantle the state's Lausanne-based traditional categorization of themselves and of Armenians in general. If the small number of Muslim Alevi Armenians that convert to Christianity solidify the connections between religion and ethnicity in Turkey, those who claim Armenianness while remaining Muslim or Alevi begin to disentangle them, these two notions. I do not belong to any of the state's categories, said one Muslim Armenian straightforwardly, and added that rather than a religious jama'at, the state should officially accept Armenians as a race and accordingly endow them with minority rights without discriminating based on religious belonging. In particular, they object against the fact that they are not allowed to send their children to Armenian schools of Istanbul. In fact, the law states that minority schools are special schools established by the Armenian, Greek or Jewish communities and, importantly, quote from the law itself, attended by students that are citizens of the Republic of Turkey and members of those very same minorities. Thus, only officially recognized members of the Armenian community, that is Christian Armenians who have baptism certificates, have the right to attend Armenian schools, and self-identifying as an Armenian is not sufficient for that. Thus, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians' Armenian identification challenges the official traditional categorization of Armenians and definition of Armenianness in Turkey. It somehow contributes to a potential secularization and ethnicization of Armenian identity. But it challenges something else as well, the Christian Armenians' understanding of Armenian identity. I'm going to be very concise here because I don't have much time left, and to speak about the relations they have with the Christian Armenians of Istanbul. Muslim and Alevi Armenians' Armenianness is often bluntly rejected by Christian Armenians of Istanbul. Furthermore, the Christian Armenians are usually reluctant, to say the least, to give the Muslim and Alevi Armenians access to their community. The matter of admission to Istanbulite Armenian schools is an example. Although the condition of being a minority member that is a Christian Armenian in order to be eligible to attend these schools is prescribed by Turkish law, the Armenian community leaders are also mostly in favor of not allowing Muslim or Alevi Armenians admission. In 2015, the state eased its control over this admission process by transferring the Ministry of Education's responsibility of checking applicants' eligibility to the school's principals. However, the community leaders set the condition of presenting baptism certificates in order to become eligible for admission to these schools, rather than using this opportunity to welcome the Muslim or Alevi Armenians. Thus, the Muslim and Alevi Armenians of Turkey are excluded not only from the Turkish Muslim nation as Armenian bastards, but also from the Christian Armenian community by most of the latter's members. Only a small, progressive and secular faction within the Christian Armenian community is willing to expand the boundaries of the community in order to incorporate the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. Unfortunately, I don't have time to discuss in detail the multiple reasons behind most Christian Armenians' rigid stance against the Muslim and Alevi Armenians. Thus, I will limit myself to simply mentioning them. Three important factors, three important reasons. First, the Christian Armenians' own understanding of Armenianness, which in line with that of the state is very much ethno-religious, at times even congregational. For them, the mere idea of the Muslim Armenian provokes a cognitive dissonance. Let them decide, they would say. Are they Muslims or Armenians? Second, their deep-rooted mistrust towards Muslims in general and the Turkish state. Are these Muslim Armenians real or sincere? Are they spies? What are their real intentions? Third, fears that welcoming the Muslim and Alevi Armenians might jeopardize their already fragile relations with the Turkish state and majority. They are much more positive and open towards those who decide to convert to Christianity and thus, according to them, become Armenian again. But the process of conversion is not easy itself, as the church is quite cautious again and puts several obstacles and conditions before agreeing to convert a Muslim or Alevi Armenian to Christianity. Naturally then, the Muslim or Alevi Armenians get disappointed and feel insulted when they come across this rigid boundary drawn by the leadership and majority of the Armenian community of Istanbul. However, they still don't give up, but rather fight for their recognition. How do they react? What are their counter-strategies? Again, I must limit myself only to listing these counter-strategies. First of all, they attempt to dismantle the Christian-Armenian ideological pairing by referring to blood and its inalterability, and by referring to pre-Christian Armenians, such as the famous King Tikran, saying, for instance, Armenians have been Christian for only 1,700 years. Were they not Armenians before? Asks Erhan, the founder of the Muslim Armenians Facebook page. You might want to check it. This is their logo. We can even speak about the logo itself.
The moon.
So you see Mount Ararat. Behind Mount Ararat is the, traditional Armenian. And on this side it's in green, because green is the color of Islam. And you can see both the symbols of Islam with the crescent and the Armenian symbol of eternity. And with the three languages, Armenian, Turkish, and English. Second, they try to spread an alternative historiography of Armenians' relations with Islam, which challenges the widespread argument that the two identities cannot be compatible because of historical enmity. They show examples of cooperation and friendship in history. And finally, and I'm ending here, they call for a redefinition of Armenianness and an expansion of its boundaries, arguing that it would be for the benefit of the nation, since it would make it larger and stronger. And I end my talk here with a quote by a Hemshin Armenian friend. And that's him standing on the letter by which his name starts, and that's in Armenia. Armenianness, he says, should be debated and reinvented. It has been restricted to a communitarian identity, which is a quite archaic model. It should be modernized and democratized. It should accept religious multiplicity. A Muslim, an Alevi, a Catholic, a Protestant, an atheist, they can all be Armenian. Neither of those denominations make someone Armenian, but all of them can be compatible with Armenianness. Thank you.